folks, and welcome to another Chasing the Facts video. I thought I would do a video on posthumous, basically posthumous artists. Those are artists that have released music after they died. Here's a definition of it.
Occurring, awarded, or appearing after the death of the originator, of a child, born after the death of its father.
That's the full meaning of posthumous.
Definitions of posthumous. Adjective. Occurring or coming into existence after a person's death. A posthumous award, a posthumous book.
Okay, we're not going to get into a posthumous artist. A posthumous authors. He's not in this video. This question was interesting. Why is it called a posthumously?
Posthumous comes from the Latin posthumus, which is itself an alteration of posthumous, born after the father's death. It is thought that the word humus, meaning dirt, earth in Latin, was substituted for humus in the mistaken belief that the word's final element had something to do with the soil in a grave.
No. I guess these are artists that came out with albums or music after they died. Janis Joplin, John Lennon, Prince, Selena, Notorious, Mr. Big. Over to go to Wikipedia. And I'll go through some of these. I'm not going to go through all of them. 19th century and earlier. 1900s to 1950s. I see here. 1960s. Jim Reeves.
Jim Reeves' album The Jim Reeves Way was released in 1965, a year after his death. Yours Sincerely was released in 1966, 2 years after his death. The album Blue Side of Lonesome was released on April 24, 1967, 3 years after his death. 6 months later, My Cathedral was released on October 23, 1967. A Touch of Sadness was released on March 25, 1968, almost 4 years after his death. The album And Some Friends was released in 1969, 5 years after his death. Jim Reeves Writes You a Record was released in 1971, 7 years after his death.
Okay. We got another biggie right here.
John Coltrane's album O.M. was released in January 1968, 6 months after his death. 6 months later, his collaborative album with Alice Coltrane, Cosmic Music, was released in July 1968. Selflessness, featuring My Favorite Things was released in 1969, 2 years after his death. The album Transition was released in July 1970, 3 years after his death. Sonship was released on April 16, 1971, 4 years after his death. The album Infinity was released in September 1972, 5 years after his death. Interstellar Space, an album containing his last recordings, was released in September 1974, 6 years after his death. The album First Meditations, for Quartet, was released in December 1977, 10 years after his death. Stellar Regions was released on October 10, 1995, 28 years after his death. The compilation album entitled Living Space was released on March 10, 1998, 31 years after his death. Both Directions at Once, an unreleased album recorded in 1963, was released on June 29, 2018, 51 years after his death. His last album Blue World was released on September 27, 2019, 52 years after his death.
Okay. Sitting on the dock of the bay. Now, Otis Redding, that's hit number 1 for Otis Redding after his death, 1970s. There's Janis Joplin.
Janis Joplin's album Pearl was released on January 11, 1971, 3 months after her death. Joplin had recorded all the vocals for all the songs, except Buried Alive in the Blues, before she died. Her band, the Full Tilt Boogie Band, recorded the music to her second posthumous album entitled Farewell Song, was released in February 1982, about 12 years after her death. Her rarity album Rare Pearls was released in 1999, the 9-disc set Blow All My Blues Away, 2012, and the Pearl Sessions, 2012. The compilation album This Is Janis Joplin was released in 1995, about 25 years after her death. She also appeared on the Lost Tapes with Big Brother and the Holding Company, released in 2008.
Okay. What else? Al Jackson Jr. 1980s.
The non-album single Love Will Tear Us Apart was released in June 1980, a month after the suicide of Joy Division lead singer Ian Curtis on May 18 of that year. Its music video was also released. The remaining members of Joy Division later went on to form New Order. A month later, their final album Closer was released on July 18, 1980. The compilation album Still was released on October 8, 1981, a year and 5 months after his death. Substance was released on July 11, 1988, 8 years after his death. The To The Peel Sessions EPs were originally released in both November 1986 and September 1987. While the entire compilation of both sessions was released in September 1990, 10 years after his death. Their planned debut album Warsaw was released in 1994, 14 years after his death. The Heart and Soul box set was released in December 1997, 17 years after his death. The live album entitled Preston February 28, 1980 was released in May 1999, 19 years after his death. The complete BBC recordings was released in October 2000, 20 years after his death. Les Bains Douches December 18, 1979 was released in April 2001, 21 years after his death. The compilation album entitled Martin Hannett's Personal Mixes was released in June 2007, 27 years after his death.
John Lennon, guess he had a large release after his death.
John Lennon was murdered on December 8, 1980. His singles Woman and Watching the Wheels were both released in 1981. The album Milk and Honey came out on January 9, 1984. Live in New York City was released on February 10, 1986, 5 years and 2 months after his death. 9 months later, his second posthumous album entitled Men Love Ave was released on November 3, 1986. The soundtrack album of the documentary called Imagine, John Lennon was released on October 10, 1988, almost 8 years after his death. The Beatles' songs Free as a Bird and Real Love were released in 1995, 15 years after his death. Both songs featured the 3 surviving Beatles playing instruments over Lennon's demos. His remix album entitled Double Fantasy Stripped Down was released on October 5, 2010, almost 30 years after his death. On the same day the Gimme Some Truth box set was released also on October 5, 2010. Gimme Some Truth. The Ultimate Mixes was released on October 9, 2020, almost 40 years after his death. Lennon also appears on many of the Beatles' album reissues released since his death. The Beatles song Now and Then was originally a Lennon's demo and was recorded in around 1977. It featured the 3 surviving Beatles playing instruments recorded in 1995. Then Lennon's voice was extracted using Peter Jackson's MAL technology, and the song was finished and released on November 2, 2023, almost 43 years after Lennon's death, and almost 22 years after Harrison's death.
Okay, this is another one right here.
The Soldier on the Wall by punk legend Alex Harvey was released in 1983, a year after his death from a heart attack. The sensational Alex Harvey Band's first live album entitled BBC Radio 1 Live in Concert, which was recorded for the BBC at the Paris Theatre 1972 and the Hippodrome 1973, was released in 1991, 9 years after Harvey's death. Their second live album entitled Live on the Test, which was recorded for the BBC between 1973 and 1977, was released in 1995, 13 years after Harvey's death. Their third live album entitled The Gospel According to Harvey, which contains the live recording of Reading Festival in 1977, was released in 1998, 16 years after Harvey's death. The reissue of the album Alex Harvey and His Soul Band, which contains 20 unreleased songs, was released in 1999, 17 years after Harvey's death. His album entitled Teenage A Go-Go, the unreleased recordings of Alex Harvey 1963-67 was released in 2003, 21 years after his death. Their fourth live album entitled British Tour 76 was released in 2004, 22 years after Harvey's death. Their fifth live album entitled US Tour 74 was released in 2006, 24 years after Harvey's death. The album entitled Hot City, which is the early version of The Impossible Dream, was released in 2009, 27 years after Harvey's death. The box set entitled Last of the Teenage Idols, which contains 21 previously unreleased songs, was released in 2016, 34 years after his death.
Okay. There's 4 albums by the Carpenters have been released since the death of Karen Carpenter, Marvin Gaye, let's see here, Badfinger, Thin Lizzy, let's see what, Roy Orbison, 1990s, Tom Fogerty.
Tom Fogerty's album Sidekicks with Randy Oda was released in 1992, 2 years after his death in 1990 from tuberculosis. He was featured in Merle Saunders' album entitled Fire Up Plus, which was released on July 9, 1992, also 2 years after his death. His compilation album The Very Best of Tom Fogerty was released on July 27, 1999, 9 years after his death. He was featured in Creedence Clearwater Revival's box set called CCR, box set. It was released on October 2, 2001, 11 years after his death. He was also featured in Creedence Clearwater Revival's live album entitled At the Royal Albert Hall. It was released on September 16, 2022, 32 years after his death.
Okay. Dill Shannon. We have here Freddie Mercury, another rocker.
Freddie Mercury solo albums. The Freddie Mercury album and The Great Pretender were both released in 1992, a year after his death from AIDS-related bronchopneumonia. Mercury also had other albums released later on. Queen's live album Live at Wembley 86 was released on May 26, 1992, 6 months after Freddie's death. Made in Heaven was released on November 6, 1995, 4 years after Freddie's death. The box set The Solo Collection was released on October 23, 2000, almost 9 years after his death. Queen on Fire, Live at the Bowl was released on October 25, 2004, almost 13 years after Freddie's death. Queen Rock Montreal was released on October 29, 2007, almost 16 years after Freddie's death. All of Queen's studio albums were re-released as remastered deluxe editions in 2011 that feature previously unreleased songs in bonus EPs. Hungarian Rhapsody, Queen Live in Budapest was released on September 20, 2012, almost 21 years after Freddie's death. Live at the Rainbow 74 was released on September 8, 2014, almost 23 years after Freddie's death. 2 months later, both Let Me In Your Heart Again and There Must Be More to Life Than This, with Michael Jackson, were released for the album Queen Forever, which was released on November 10, 2014, almost 23 years after Freddie's death, and 5 years after Jackson's death. A Night at the Odeon was released on November 20, 2015, almost 24 years after Freddie's death. On Air was released on November 6, 2016, almost 25 years after Freddie's death. The box set Never Boring was released on October 11, 2019, almost 28 years after his death. Queen released the Miracle Collector's Edition featuring the song Face It Alone and 5 other unreleased demos was released on November 18, 2022, almost 31 years after Freddie's death.
Okay. You got anyone else to highlight? And Frank Zappa. I did quite a bit that.
Frank Zappa's album Civilization Phase 3 was released on October 31, 1994, 10 months after his death of prostate cancer in 1993. Also multiple album reissues and box sets from his solo work and his work with the Mothers of Invention were released after his death. The compilation album entitled The Lost Episodes was released on February 27, 1996, 3 years after his death. Mystery Disc was released on September 14, 1998, 5 years after his death. The album Everything Is Healing Nicely was released on December 21, 1999, 6 years after his death. The live album entitled FZ Oz was released on August 16, 2002, 9 years after his death. Another live album Halloween was released on February 4, 2003, 10 years after his death. Joe's Corsage was released on May 30, 2004, 11 years after his death. 4 months later Quodiophiliac was released on September 14, 2004. Transfusion was released on October 24, 2006, 13 years after his death. 2 months later, The Mofo Project / Object was released on December 5, 2006. The live album entitled Joe's Menage was released on October 1, 2008, 15 years after his death. Road Tapes, Venue 1 was released on October 31, 2012, 19 years after his death. On the same day, the compilation album entitled Understanding America was released on October 31, 2012. Road Tapes, Venue 2 was released on October 31, 2013, 20 years after his death. The album Dance Me This was released on June 21, 2015, 22 years after his death. Road Tapes, Venue 3 was released on May 27, 2016, 23 years after his death. 6 months later, his 3-disc compilation album entitled Meet Light was released on November 4, 2016. This album features members of the Mothers of Invention, Ray Collins, Jimmy Carl Black, Billy Mundy, and Jim Motorhead Sherwood. The Hot Rats Sessions box set was released on December 20, 2019, 26 years after his death. The album Funky Nothingness was released on June 30, 2023, 30 years after his death. Whiskey A Go Go 1968 was released on June 21, 2024, 31 years after his death. Nirvana's live album MTV Unplugged in New York was released on November 1, 1994, 7 months after Kurt Cobain's death on April 5 of the same year. 2 weeks later, Live Tonight, Sold Out was released on November 15, 1994. From the Muddy Banks of the Wishkah was released on October 1, 1996, 2 years after his death. Their self-titled Greatest Hits album featuring the song You Know You're Right, recorded on January 30, 1994, at Robert Lang Studios during their final studio session was finally released on October 29, 2002, 8 years after Cobain's death. The box set with the Lights Out featuring unreleased demos, outtakes, and live tracks was released on November 23, 2004, 10 years after Kid's death. The compilation album Sliver, The Best of the Box was released on November 1, 2005, 11 years after his death. Live at Reading was released on November 2, 2009, 15 years after Kit's death. A day later, the 20th anniversary deluxe edition of their debut studio album Bleach was released on November 3, 2009, featuring Nirvana's unreleased live performance at the Pine Street Theater in 1990. Live at the Paramount was released on September 24, 2011, 17 years after Cobain's death. Live and Loud was released on September 23, 2013, 19 years after Kit's death. 2 months later, the 2013 mix of In Utero was released on November 22, 2013. The release of the single Penny Royalty was cancelled due to Cobain's death in April 1994. The song was finally re-released on Record Store Day 14, April 19, 2014, 20 years after Cobain's death. The soundtrack album of the documentary montage of Heck featuring Kit's personal cassettes including spoken word, demos, covers and full songs was released on November 13, 2015, 21 years after Kit's death.
Let's see here. Tupac
Shakur's first and only album under the name Machiavelli called The Don Killuminati, The 7-Day Theory was released on November 5, 1996, 2 months after his murder in September. The double album entitled Are You Still Down? Remember Me, was released on November 25, 1997, a year after his death. His greatest hits album featuring 4 previously unreleased tracks was released on November 24, 1998, 2 years after his death. His collaboration album with his group Outlaws called Still I Rise was released on December 21, 1999, 3 years after his death. Until the End of Time was released on March 27, 2001, 5 years after his death. 9 months later, his only collaborative EP under the name Machiavelli entitled Don't Go to Sleep featuring Daz Dillinger was released on December 24, 2001. His last double album called Better Days was released on November 26, 2002, 6 years after his death. His remix album New Mix Classics was released on October 7, 2003, 7 years after his death. A month later, the soundtrack album to the documentary called Tupac, Resurrection was released on November 11, 2003. Tupac Live was released on August 10, 2004, 8 years after his death. 4 months later, Loyal to the Game was released on December 14, 2004. Live at the House of Blues was released on September 5, 2005, 9 years after his death. His last album called PAC's Life was released on November 21, 2006, 10 years after his death. New Mix Classics Volume 2 was released on August 14, 2007, 11 years after his death.
Okay. Let's see here. There's quite a bit here.
Zilch's debut album 3.2.1 was released on July 23, 1998, 2 months after Japanese vocalist Hyde's death in May. Hyde with Spread Beaver's first and only studio album with Hyde entitled J.A. Zoo was released on November 21, 1998, 6 months after his death. The remix album entitled Bastard Eyes by his U.S. band Zilch was released on March 3, 1999, 10 months after his death. He appeared on the album Tribute Spirits via a song called Celebration featuring I.N.A., Pata and Heath, originally performed by X Japan via the album Blue Blood. Both the song and album are released on May 1, 1999, a year after his death. The re-recording of Hyde's song Tell Me featuring his band Spread Beaver was released on January 19, 2000, 2 years after his death. X Japan's live album The Last Live was released on May 5, 2001, 3 years after his death. His last single In Motion was released on July 10, 2002, 4 years after his death. The compilation album singles Junk Story along with the song Junk Story was released 2 weeks later on July 24, 2002. 5 months later, he was featured in X Japan's remix album Trans X, which was released on December 4, 2002. The compilation album entitled King of Cyborg Rockstar along with his rendition of the song Miscast, originally performed by X Japan via the album Jealousy, was released on April 28, 2004, 6 years after his death. He was featured in X Japan's single IV. It was released on January 23, 2008, 9 years and 8 months after his death. 2 months later, his live album called Science A Go Go was released on March 19, 2008. Another live album Haidar Sai Community was released a month later on April 23, 2008. Kogal, a song that was finished using Vocaloid technology to mimic his voice along with its compilation album of the same name, was released on December 10, 2014, 16 years and 7 months after his death. He was featured in X Japan's soundtrack album of their documentary entitled We Are X. The album was released on March 3, 2017, almost 19 years after his death.
Let's see here. 2020. I guess there's a couple of them.
Joey Ramone's debut solo album Don't Worry About Me was released on February 19, 2002, a year after his death from lymphoma in 2001. Few months later, Dee Ramone died and his collaborative album featuring the band Youth Gone Mad in their self-titled album was released on December 31, 2002, 6 months after his death in June. 8 months later, both were featured on Ramone's live album NYC 1978 released on August 19, 2003, 2 years after Joey's death and a year after Dee Dee's death. Joey's second solo album, Ya No, was released on May 22, 2012, 11 years after his death. Johnny Ramone is featured on Morrissey Curate's The Ramones, which was released on November 28, 2014, 10 years after his death in 2004.
Okay, we'll get George Harrison here.
George Harrison was featured in the song Horse to the Water on the album Small World, Big Band by Jules Holland's Rhythm and Blues Orchestra. He died from lung cancer in 2001. Harrison's album Brainwashed was completed by his son Danny Harrison and producer Jeff Lynne. The album was released in November 2002, 1 year after his death. The Beatles remix album entitled Let It Be Naked was released on November 17, 2003, almost 2 years after Harrison's death, and almost 23 years after John Lennon's death. Early Takes, Volume 1 was released on May 1, 2012, 10 years and 6 months after his death. Harrison appears on many album reissues by the Beatles since his death. The Beatles' live album Get Back, the rooftop performance was released on January 28, 2022, 21 years after Harrison's death, and 42 years after Lennon's death.
George Harrison released a documentary through Highway 61 Entertainment, I think it was. The documentary is supposed to be about how Paul McCartney's death was staged and a look-alike was put in its place. It was called Paul McCartney is Really Dead. Let's see here. Johnny Cash.
Johnny Cash's box set entitled Unearthed was released on November 25, 2003, 2 months after his death. Also, many live and collaboration albums have been released as well. 4 months later, My Mother's Hymn Book was released as standalone album on April 6, 2004. American v. 100 Highways was released on July 4, 2006, 3 years after his death. American 6, Ain't No Grave was released on February 23, 2010, 7 years after his death. Out Among the Stars, an unreleased album recorded between 1981 and 1984 was released on March 25, 2014, 11 years after his death. His wife June Carter Cash was also featured in this album on 2 tracks. Johnny Cash and the RPO was released on November 13, 2020, 17 years after his death. Songwriter, an unreleased album recorded in 1993 was released on June 28, 2024, 21 years after his death.
Okay, so we got here, Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson's song This Is It along with its soundtrack album was released on October 26, 2009, 4 months after his death in June. I Want You Back. Unreleased Masters, a compilation of previously unreleased Jackson 5 songs and alternate versions of some of the group's hits, was released on November 10, 2009, roughly 5 months after Michael's death. The music video for his song One More Chance, which was filmed on November 17, 2003, was finished and released in a deluxe DVD box set Michael Jackson's Vision on November 22, 2010, 16 months after his death. A month later, his first posthumous album of all new material, simply titled Michael, was released on December 14, 2010. A remix album entitled Immortal was released on November 18, 2011, 2 years after his death. Come and Get It, The Rare Pearls, another compilation of previously unreleased Jackson 5 songs, was released digitally on August 28, 2012 and psychically on September 18, 2012, 3 years after his death. The 25th anniversary edition reissue of Bad entitled Bad 25, featuring 6 unreleased tracks and his live performance at Wembley Stadium in 1988, was released on the same day on September 18, 2012. His second posthumous album entitled Escape was released on May 13, 2014, about 5 years after his death. The 40th anniversary edition reissue of Thriller entitled Thriller 40, featuring 10 unreleased tracks, was released on November 18, 2022, 13 years after his death.
Okay, 2010, okay, this is another one that's highlighted.
Dio's live album at Dunnington, UK, Live 1983 and 1987 was released on November 9, 2010, nearly 6 months after Ronnie James Dio's death from stomach cancer. Heaven and Hell's live album Neon Nights, 30 Years of Heaven and Hell was released on November 16, 2010, 6 months after his death. Ronnie was featured in the song Metal Will Never Die, recorded in 2008, by David Rock Feinstein, guitarist in the bands Ronnie Dio and the Prophets, Elf, and the Rods, in the album Bitten by the Beast, which was released on November 22, 2010, 6 months after his death. He was also featured in the song The Code, also recorded in 2008, by the Rods, in the album Vengeance, which was released on May 23, 2011, a year after his death. Ronnie Dio and the Prophets songs Judy's Theme, That's All and Fallen were featured in the compilation album The Early Years, which was released in Spain in 2012, 2 years after his death. Dio's live album Finding the Sacred Heart, Live in Philly 1986 was released on June 17, 2013, 3 years after his death. Another Dio's live album Live in London, Hammersmith Apollo 1993 was released on May 12, 2014, nearly 4 years after his death.
Okay. Now Whitney Houston, I guess. Pink Floyd. I guess I'd read this because most people like Pink Floyd.
Pink Floyd's 2014 album The Endless River was released 6 years after keyboardist Richard Wright's death. The album consists almost entirely of leftover instrumentals featuring Wright from the recording sessions for 1994's The Division Bell. Wright's speaking vocals is featured on David Gilmour's song A Boat Lies Waiting, from the album Rattle That Lock. He also appeared in Barn Jams with Gilmore, which were filmed and recorded in January 2007, and some of the jams were released on Gilmore's albums, Live in Gdansk DVD, the deluxe edition of Rattle That Lock and Luck and Strange, with the song of the same title and the original version as a bonus track. He was featured in Pink Floyd's live album The Dark Side of the Moon Live at Wembley 1974, released on March 24, 2023, 15 years after his death.
Good grief. David Bowie.
8 months after David Bowie's 2016 death from liver cancer, The Gooster, an early version of Young Americans, was released as part of the box set Who Can I Be Now? 1974 to 1976. Just 2 days short of the one-year anniversary of Bowie's death, the EP No Plan was released, featuring 3 studio recordings of Bowie performing songs from his musical Lazarus, which had previously only been recorded by the musical's cast. The songs on No Plan are stated to be the last 3 songs Bowie had ever recorded in his lifetime. Live Nassau Coliseum 76 was released on February 10, 2017, a year after his death. 2 months later, another live album called Cracked Actor was released on April 22, 2017. Welcome to the Blackout was released on April 21, 2018, 2 years after his death. 6 months later, Never Let Me Down 2018 was released on October 12, 2018. Glastonbury 2000 was released a month later on November 30, 2018. The compilation album called Spying Through a Keyhole was released on April 5, 2019, 3 years after his death. 7 months later, the box set entitled Conversation Piece was released on November 15, 2019. The EP entitled Is It Any Wonder? Was released on February 14, 2020, 4 years after his death. Changes Now Bowie was released 2 months later on April 17, 2020. 4 months later, I'm Only Dancing was released on August 29, 2020. The album called Toy was released on November 26, 2021, 5 years after his death.
Prince. Okay. What else? AC/DC. Falling Down. I don't think that has anything to do with the Tears for Fears song. Okay, here's another one that's highlighted.
Chester Bennington of Linkin Park is on the band's album One More Light Live, released on December 15, 2017, just 5 months after Bennington's suicide. It was a European tour for the album One More Light just weeks before he died. Bennington featured on the song Cross Off by Mark Morton, from the album Anesthetic, which was released in 2019. Bennington's former band, Grey Days, released their album Amends on June 26, 2020, nearly 3 years after his suicide. The 20th anniversary edition of Linkin Park's album Hybrid Theory was released on October 9, 2020, with many unreleased songs and demos from 1996 to 2002. Grey Days' album The Phoenix was released on June 17, 2022, 5 years after his death. The 20th anniversary edition of Meteora was released on April 7, 2023, including the songs Lost and Fighting Myself. The compilation album entitled Paper Cuts, Singles Collection 2000 to 2023, featuring the song Friendly Fire, an outtake from the One More Light sessions, was finally released on April 12, 2024, 7 years after his death. Its music video was also released.
What else? 2020. And Kenny Rogers, huh? Okay, it's all of them for now. Yeah, this page will probably be updated as time goes on, but I'm not going to do a updated version of this video. There'll probably be more and more artists that will release music after they died. what artists do is they'll record music and not release it, and they'll hide it in a vault somewhere. Then when they die, someone will come along and open the vault and publish it for the artist, so that the music industry can keep making more and more money off of them. I believe most artists are just cash cows for whatever record company they're under. But I'm going to put an end to this video right here. You can probably do research on this topic yourself. As for me, this is going to be the end of the video right here. So thanks for watching, and take care, folks, and I'll talk at you later. Bye.